Hello everyone, this is Showtime 112. In this video, we are going to talk about the first clash between South African and Cuban pilots in Angola. If you're not familiar with so-called South African border wars, this might sound a little confusing. What were Cubans doing in Africa? And why was South Africa intervening militarily in Angola, a country with which it doesn't even share a border? When you look at the map today, between those two there is a country called Namibia. It became officially independent in 1990, but until that time it was known as Southwest Africa, and it was administered by Republic of South Africa. This situation originated from World War I, when former German colonies were placed under mandates of various nations to administer them until they could govern themselves. South Africa was given the mandate over Southwest Africa, but their plan was to eventually annex its territory. There never was enough international support for this, but South Africa persisted. An organization called SWAPO emerged as the result. Their objective was Southwest African independence, and they resorted to armed insurgency to achieve this. They received support and shelter from Angolan government, which resulted in South African direct military intervention in Angola, and support to a large anti-government insurgent group called UNITA. Angola in turn received strong support from the communist bloc, most directly from Cuba, which provided not only advisors, but even troops fighting directly on behalf of the Angolan government. In August 1981, South Africans launched Operation Protea. The objective was to create a buffer zone in Angolan territory, at least 50 kilometers deep. This would deny SWAPO groups the ability to infiltrate Southwest Africa from Angola. The push was heavily supported by the South African Air Force in its largest operation since World War II. Angolan Air Force offered no resistance with their MiG-21 fighters during Operation Protea. Their units were flown by a mix of Angolan and Cuban pilots. Even the latter were mostly inexperienced. So the operation was a great success for the South Africans, and their aircraft had a total air superiority over the battlefield. Intelligence was soon gathered that SWAPO forces were regrouping about 150 kilometers inland, and in November 1981, South Africa launched Operation Daisy, another attempt to suppress the SWAPO inside Angolan territory. On the third day of the operation, 6 November 1981, the Cuban pilots finally attempted to confront the South African Air Force. Two Mirage F-1s were on standby alert in Air Force Base on Dangwa, Southwest Africa. At 7 a.m., ground radars detected two fast-moving tracks going south from Lubango, the Angolan air base. The Mirages were flown by Major Johan Rankin and Lieutenant Johan du Plessis, both graduates of South African Advanced Fighter School and both well-trained in air combat maneuvers. Their aircraft were the most modern ones available to the South African Air Force, purchased just before the UN weapons embargo imposed in 1976. On the other side, the two MiG-21 MFs were flown by two Cuban lieutenants, Ezequiel Cancela Vasquez and Donacio Valdez Espinosa. They were both junior pilots, hardly qualified to fly combat operations. Valdez Espinosa had only flown 38 hours in the last 16 months. Cancela Vasquez was the flight leader since he had more than 300 hours on the MiG-21. They were supposed to provide cover for some special operations force south of Lubango, but then the ground control advised them of enemy aircraft about 120 kilometers away from them at about 4,000 meters of altitude. Despite knowing of the pilots' inexperience, despite having problems with maintaining radio contact with them, and despite knowing that the two South African aircraft were probably superior Mirage F-1s, ground control still vectored the MiGs to intercept. South African wingman Johan du Plessis was the first one to establish a visual contact. The MiGs were 5 miles away to the left and at about the same altitude. The Mirages jettisoned their fuel tanks and entered a hard left turn. They managed to position themselves behind the MiGs, whose pilots were not yet aware of their presence. The Cuban wingman was trailing the leader by about 300 to 400 meters and about 30 degrees behind. Since they were flying into the sun, Matra 550 IR homing missiles were not an option. Johann Rankin opened gunfire from about 350 meters, and MiG pilots suddenly became aware of their situation. Both MiGs then entered a hard left turn while dropping their fuel tanks. Rankin attempted to launch a missile at the leader, but it malfunctioned. He then switched back to the wingman while ordering Duplessis to follow the MiG leader. The second MiG, flown by Valdez Espinosa, then made a mistake and reversed his turn. This enabled Rankin to position himself close to his 6 o'clock. He fired a burst of cannon fire from a very short range, and then barely evaded the debris. He then watched the MiG-21 spiral to the ground, while the pilot managed to eject safely. At the same time, Johann Duplessis was following the MiG leader, Ezequiel Cancela Vasquez, who attempted to evade him by spiral maneuvers. Twice, the MiG entered the Mirage's firing parameters for the Matra 550 missile, but it malfunctioned. The MiG leader managed to evade his pursuer and landed safely. This was the first aerial victory for the South African Air Force since the Korean War. Despite the success, bad news was that the missiles Mirages carried could not be relied upon in real combat situations. Cubans had little trouble defining the causes of their loss. They temporarily suspended aerial operations south of the 16th parallel and ordered that MiG flight should always combine novices with experienced pilots. Cuban MiG-21s and South African Mirage F-1s would meet again in combat in October 1982, but that is a story for another video. If you like this one, be sure to press the like button. Support the channel on Patreon if you want the channel to keep producing content, join our Discord server, and keep watching Showtime 112.